First, opening. The deadly misunderstanding. If you were dropped into a Viking winter tonight, no electricity, no gas, no wall fireplace, there's a brutal truth most people don't want to hear. You wouldn't lose to the cold because you're not tough enough. You'd lose because you'd make modern mistakes, and those mistakes can kill in a matter of days. We've been trained by movies to believe Vikings simply ignored winter, that they were born with iron blood, walking through blizzards in thin clothing, sleeping in crude huts like it was nothing. But the real Viking world was an ice kingdom where darkness could stretch 18, sometimes 20 hours, and where temperatures in parts of Scandinavia plunged to -15, -20, even -30 degrees Celsius. In that environment, the modern lifestyle collapses fast. A wet cotton layer becomes a sponge. A drafty room turns into a refrigerator. A cold bed becomes a trap. And if you try to power through it, your body quietly bleeds heat until your thinking slows, your hands stop working, and your judgment fails before you even realize you're in danger. So how did Viking families live, sleep, work, and raise children in conditions that would break most modern systems within 72 hours? The answer isn't a single trick, and it isn't bravery. Vikings didn't endure winter, they redesigned life around it. Their warmth was not toughness, it was systems engineering. And that matters today, because what you're about to hear isn't ancient folklore. It's a survival blueprint, one that still applies in modern America, in a world where power grids fail, storms isolate communities, and technology can vanish overnight. Second, the core principle, not making heat, but stopping heat loss. Here is the difference between a modern mindset and a Viking mindset, and it's the kind of difference that decides who survives. Modern people think the battle against cold is won by generating more heat. Turn the thermostat up, add another heater, burn more fuel. Vikings understood something deeper. The battle is won by refusing to lose heat in the first place. In a typical modern American home, especially during a winter outage, the enemy is invisible. Heat leaks through thin walls, through ceilings, through windows, through tiny gaps you never notice until it's too late. The temperature drops room by room, hour by hour, and once the structure starts losing heat, no single heat source can keep up. Now compare that to a Viking longhouse. It wasn't primitive, it was engineered. Heat loss was slowed by trapped air pockets inside thick walls. Warmth was stored in heavy materials that acted like thermal batteries, and heat was multiplied using biological sources, living systems that produced warmth day and night without electricity or fuel deliveries. This is why the Viking system worked. It wasn't one solution, it was many small solutions layered together. And in this documentary, we'll break that system into 5 levels: the body, sleep, architecture, biological heat, and finally, movement and energy. How Vikings stayed mobile and alive when snow buried the land and darkness ruled the day. But everything begins at the smallest scale. Not with the house, not with the fire. It begins with the human body, because in winter, your body is either a protected furnace or an exposed liability. Third, level 1. The body is the heater, not the clothing. Vikings treated clothing the way modern people treat technology. Not as fashion, but as equipment, precise, deliberate, and unforgiving of mistakes. Their foundation was wool, and the reason had nothing to do with tradition. Wool stays warm even when damp. That single property has saved lives for centuries. Wool fibers trap air, and that trapped air becomes insulation. Even more importantly, properly prepared wool retained natural lanolin, a waxy barrier that resisted moisture instead of absorbing it. Now consider what many people rely on today during winter emergencies. Cotton hoodies, denim jeans, thin socks, comfortable clothing that feels warm indoors but collapses the moment moisture appears. Cotton doesn't forgive mistakes. When it gets wet, it steals heat. Vikings didn't build survival systems on comfort. They built them on physics. They also didn't rely on 1 or 2 layers. A Viking wore 7 or 8 layers because each layer created an air chamber. Not tight, not compressed, loose enough to trap still air between fabric and skin. That trapped air was the insulation. That was the barrier between life and hypothermia. Against the skin came linen, not for warmth, but for moisture control. Sweat in winter is dangerous. Moisture turns your body into a cooling engine. Over that came heavier wool layers, and here's a detail most people miss. When fur was used, it often faced inward, against the body. This wasn't about appearance, it was about trapping heat where it mattered most. And then there's the science that hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Your body loses heat fastest through your head, your neck, your hands, and your feet. That's why Vikings covered their heads even indoors. Not out of superstition, but because they understood the map of heat loss. A warm core means nothing if your extremities fail. So here is the first lesson for modern America, and it's one that matters the moment the power goes out. Light, thin, absorbent clothing is not your friend. Proper wool layering spaced correctly, moisture managed with protected head and feet beats expensive high-tech outerwear the moment heating systems fail. And once the body is protected, the real danger begins. Because the cold does not attack you the same way when you are awake. The cold becomes truly lethal when you lie down to sleep. Fourth, Level 2, sleep, where modern people die first. There is an uncomfortable truth that rarely appears in survival manuals. Most people who die from cold do not die while walking through a storm. They die at night. They die quietly while resting when the body's defenses are lowered and heat loss accelerates without warning. Vikings understood this. That is why their sleep system was not an afterthought. It was one of the most carefully engineered parts of their survival strategy. A Viking bed was not furniture, it was insulation. It was raised off the ground because cold air sinks, and sleeping directly on the floor meant surrendering heat to frozen earth all night long. The base of the bed was layered with dried straw, heather, or marsh grass, materials chosen not for softness, but for their ability to trap air. On top of this came sheepskins with the wool facing upward, followed by thick wool blankets. Every layer served a thermal purpose, but the most important feature was what surrounded the bed. Heavy wool or leather curtains hung from ceiling beams, enclosing the sleeping area completely. This created a room inside a room, a sealed microclimate where body heat could accumulate instead of drifting into the larger house. Within minutes of lying down, the temperature inside these curtain beds rose dramatically, even if the rest of the longhouse remained cold. Vikings also slept together, not because of tradition, but because of biology. A resting human body produces roughly 100 watts of heat. 6 to 8 people sleeping in close contact generated the equivalent of a continuous space heater. Children and elders were placed in the center, where temperatures were most stable, while stronger adults slept on the edges, acting as living thermal shields. This was not sentiment, it was heat management, and when the night was especially cold, Vikings added another layer of security: heated stones. Smooth river stones or soapstone were warmed for hours in the hearth, then wrapped in thick wool or hide and placed beneath bedding before sleep. These stones released steady heat for 6 to 8 hours, turning the bed into a thermal reservoir. In effect, they were ancient hot water bottles, except they required no metal, no rubber, and no technology beyond fire and stone. This system echoes forward through history. During World War II, soldiers abandoned traditional sleeping bags in extreme cold and instead used cocoon-style shelter tubes that trapped body heat and blocked wind. The reason is the same. In damp, freezing environments, modern sleeping bags fail when insulation collapses and moisture accumulates. Vikings solved this problem 1,000 years earlier by focusing on microclimates, shared heat, and controlled airflow. The lesson for today is clear. In a winter power outage, survival does not depend on how warm your house feels while you are awake. It depends on how well you protect your body when you sleep, because that is when the cold takes advantage. 5. Level 3. Architecture. The house as a thermal machine. To a modern eye, a Viking longhouse might look simple, but that simplicity is deceptive. A longhouse was not merely shelter from wind and snow. It was a carefully tuned thermal system designed to slow heat loss, store warmth, and distribute it evenly across living space. The shape mattered first. Longhouses were narrow and elongated, a deliberate choice that reduced surface area relative to interior volume. Less surface area meant fewer pathways for heat to escape. The walls were massive, often 1 to 2 meters thick, built from timber frameworks packed with clay, straw, dung, and sand, or from stacked turf blocks in regions where wood was scarce. These walls were not solid barriers. They were filled with trapped air pockets that functioned as insulation, dramatically slowing heat transfer. Turf houses took this concept even further. Earth and grass are not cold materials when used correctly. They are thermal batteries. During the day, even minimal heat from hearth fires and human activity was absorbed into the mass of the walls. At night, that heat was slowly released back into the living space. Modern thermal imaging of reconstructed turf structures shows interior temperatures remaining significantly warmer than outside air, even with very small fires. The roof was perhaps the most ingenious element of all. Viking longhouses had no chimneys. Smoke escaped through adjustable openings along the roof ridge. As warm smoke rose, it traveled slowly beneath thick layers of thatch and turf, transferring heat into the roof itself before leaving the building. The entire roof became a radiant heat panel, warming the space below long after the flames had settled. Even the floor played a role. Packed earth floors were covered regularly with fresh straw, creating a living layer of insulation that reduced heat loss to the ground. This straw was replaced often, keeping the system dry and effective. Cold air sinking toward the floor was controlled, not ignored. Now compare this to many modern American homes. Drywall and foam insulation can slow heat loss, but they store almost no thermal energy. When the power goes out, indoor temperatures drop rapidly. Viking houses cooled slowly. That difference can mean the difference between discomfort and survival. The Viking home was not warm because of fire alone. It was warm because every surface worked together to preserve heat. 6th. Level 4. Biology. Humans and animals as living heaters. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Viking winter survival is this one, because to modern sensibilities it feels uncomfortable, even unthinkable. Vikings lived with their animals, not nearby, not outside, under the same roof. A single cow produces roughly 1,000 watts of heat, continuously, day and night. That is the equivalent of a large space heater that never turns off. A small Viking household might shelter several cows, sheep, goats, and other livestock through the winter months. Combined, these animals generated more heat than many modern heating systems. And because warm air rises, that heat naturally spread through the structure of the longhouse, warming human living areas above and beside the animals. There was another layer to this system. Straw bedding mixed with animal waste created a slow, controlled fermentation process that released additional heat at ground level. This primitive form of compost heating stabilized floor temperatures and reduced heat loss from below. It was biological engineering long before the term existed. Living with animals brought other advantages. Livestock survived winter storms more reliably. Milk production continued because animals were warm and less stressed. Daily care required less exposure to dangerous outdoor conditions. Everything about the system reduced energy expenditure while increasing resilience. This logic carried forward into American frontier history. Barns attached to houses, shared walls, and enclosed animal shelters were common for the same reason. Heat mattered more than comfort. Modern zoning laws and building codes separated animals from living spaces, prioritizing sanitation and efficiency, but often at the cost of resilience. For Vikings, animals were not just resources, they were partners in survival. Living furnaces that turned food into heat without fuel deliveries, power lines, or mechanical systems. And when you understand this layer, the full picture becomes clear. Viking warmth did not come from one source. It came from a network of small, reliable systems, each reinforcing the others, each compensating when conditions turned deadly. 7. Level 5. Fuel and internal heat. By the time winter arrived, Vikings understood a truth that modern nutrition often ignores. In extreme cold, food is not just sustenance, food is fuel, and the body itself becomes a furnace. If that furnace runs low, no amount of clothing or shelter can save you. The cornerstone of Viking winter survival was fat. Not lean protein, not light meals. Fat. Pure, calorie-dense energy. Gram for gram, fat produces more than twice the energy of carbohydrates or protein. Vikings didn't know the numbers, but they knew the result. Fat burned longer, steadier, and warmer inside the body. During winter, a working Viking could consume 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, sometimes more. This was not excess, it was necessity. Those calories fueled body heat, physical labor, and recovery in an environment that constantly pulled warmth away. Butter was eaten generously. Animal fats were added to nearly every meal. Cuts of meat we trim away today were prized because they carried warmth. Meals were designed with thermal logic. Thick stews simmered for hours, combining fatty meats, bone marrow, root vegetables, and dairy. Eating a bowl of hot stew raised core temperature measurably, and you could feel the warmth spread outward through the chest and limbs. Fatty fish like herring, salmon, and mackerel provided oils that sustained heat production long after the meal ended. The evening meal was always the heaviest. Vikings fed the furnace before sleep, knowing the body would burn through the night to stay warm. Hot drinks mattered too. Warm milk, herbal infusions, and heated ale didn't just add heat physically. They provided psychological warmth, calming the body and reinforcing a sense of safety before long winter nights. Modern comparisons are revealing. Low-fat diets reduce cold tolerance. Eating less in winter makes people feel colder, not lighter or healthier. The Viking lesson is simple and uncomfortable. In the cold, restriction weakens you. Fuel sustains you. 8. Bathhouses and heat therapy, not a luxury. Vikings also used heat deliberately, not just passively. The bathhouse was not a place of indulgence, it was medicine. These structures were built separately and heated intensely, often reaching temperatures that would feel overwhelming to the unprepared. Stones were heated until glowing, and water was thrown onto them to release waves of steam. Why endure such heat? Because Vikings understood what cold does to the body. Cold constricts blood vessels, slows healing, and weakens resistance to illness. Heat reverses this. In the bathhouse, circulation surged. Muscles relaxed, joints loosened. The risk of frostbite and infection dropped. After heating, some Vikings rushed into cold air or snow, practicing what we now call contrast therapy. Heat followed by cold shocked the system, improved circulation, and strengthened tolerance. Modern research in Scandinavia confirms what Vikings observed through experience. Regular sauna use is associated with lower mortality, improved cardiovascular health, and greater resilience to cold stress. These bath sessions were not daily. Fuel was precious, but weekly or bi-weekly use was considered essential. Heat was applied strategically, not wastefully. Once again, Viking survival was not about excess. It was about timing, balance, and understanding the body.
Ninth.
Winter movement. Skiing is life. Winter kills through immobility. Vikings refused to be trapped. When snow buried the land, they did not wait it out. They moved across it. Skiing was not sport, it was survival. Viking skis distributed body weight across the snow, preventing sinking and conserving energy. One ski was often longer and smoother for gliding, while the other provided traction for pushing forward. With a single long pole for balance and control, Vikings could travel efficiently through terrain that would exhaust a walking person in minutes. This efficiency mattered. Hunting, gathering firewood, checking traps, visiting neighboring settlements, none of it stopped in winter. Skiing turned deep snow into a highway, and the movement itself generated heat. Vigorous skiing raised core temperature rapidly, warming the body for hours afterward. Modern people are often snow-trapped. Roads close, supplies run thin, energy use spikes while movement decreases. Vikings solved this by designing mobility into winter life. They didn't wait for spring. They engineered winter into something navigable.
10th.
Conclusion. The lesson for modern America. When you step back and look at the full picture, one truth becomes unavoidable. Vikings did not rely on a single solution. They built a system. Layered clothing protected the body. Sleep systems preserved heat at night. Architecture slowed heat loss. Animals generated biological warmth. Food fueled internal fires. Heat therapy maintained health. Movement preserved mobility. Each part was modest on its own. Together, they formed a survival network that worked without electricity, without pipelines, and without centralized infrastructure. This matters today. Winter blackouts, energy shortages, off-grid living, and extreme weather events are no longer hypothetical. The Viking lesson is not to abandon modern comfort, but to stop relying on single points of failure. Redundancy saves lives. Systems outperform gadgets. Vikings did not survive winter by fighting it. They redesigned life around it.
And in doing so,
They left behind a blueprint that still works if we are willing to learn from it.